Okay, well, thank you, Ron, very much for those kind words. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and hello to our colleagues in the global community, scattered around the globe, whatever time of day it is for you. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, good night. We hope the gods of cyberspace are kind to us and keep us connected. Just have to correct one small thing Ron said. My background wasn't in economics. I've actually made a career of advising people about disciplines I know nothing about. Economics was one of them, and I'm about to do the same with you guys tonight. My own background actually was in literature and classics. But I'm based here at Durham in the north of England. This is our rather splendid cathedral. Just had a new paint job, as you can see. But what I'm going to talk to you tonight about is threshold concepts, and thank you to AMEE and to Ron for the kind invitation. It's a great privilege to open your conference and a great pleasure to be in this wonderful old cultured city of Vienna. What I would like to do in the time that we have is four things. First of all, because for some of you this will be perhaps a new notion, unpack a little bit of the terminology. We'll try to keep the educational jargon to a minimum, but we'll explain what we mean by threshold concepts, how they differ from other kinds of concepts, explain what we understand by troublesome knowledge, and actually explain that troublesome knowledge is a good thing. And we'll also unpack a couple of other terms, liminality, what we mean by liminal states in learning, and ontological shifts, and that should be enough jargon to get us through. Hopefully by the end of this session, you'll know enough about this approach to learning that you could try it on for size in that sense. And what I would like to do secondly is just point you to some interesting work that's already being done or has been done over the last 10 years or so in medicine and in other health professions using the threshold concepts framework. And if you are interested in this and you want to know more, I'll show you where you can find a lot of papers and a lot of work archived on various sites and journals around that. We call it an analytic framework rather than a theory. Theory is a rather grand notion with kind of predictive qualities. We see this as an analytic tool that you can use to do a number of things. One, to analyze your students' learning, particularly students who are having conceptual difficulty and getting stuck. Secondly, as a tool for designing curricula, and as Ron said, this term by my colleague Eric Meyer of threshold concepts as the jewels in the curriculum, the things that will really matter and remain important 10, 20 years hence. It's also, thirdly, can be used as a research tool, an educational research tool to investigate learning in medical and health settings. Finally, hoping we have time, I'd just like to set this approach in a kind of wider educational cultural context amidst other prevailing notions of university learning that are going on at the moment, because it sits uneasily with some of the more prevailing ones you may be familiar with, and then finish up with just some final implications to students. Okay, so let's first of all try and unpack a little bit about what threshold concepts are. And before I do that, I would just say that in my book, and I've just retired now, but in my years of teaching, and I think this is the only one-size-fits-all phrase I would ever use in education, because there is so much variability, as you all know. But I would say that whether you're studying surgery or occupational therapy or jazz or classical studies, we want to produce graduates who will come out with the capability in whatever field they're working in to make informed and reasoned judgments. And the reason we need to develop students who can do that is so that they can make good decisions. I want people to make good decisions about my health as I go into retirement, and I think that's what all education is about. To do that, I think they're going to have to, in the current climate, inevitably encounter situations of uncertainty and risk in order to make those decisions. And I like Lee Schulman's statement and the term he used of the need for pedagogies of uncertainty. And I'm going to suggest that threshold concepts is such a pedagogy of uncertainty. What he says was that if we're going to produce those graduates who can make decisions in a complex, risky world, then we have to bring that world into the academy, into the medical schools. And what he says is this will bring emotion with it, even a modicum of passion, he says. I would say that without a certain amount of anxiety and risk, there's a limit to how much learning occurs, which is an interestingly provocative statement. One must have something at stake. And I think you people and the professions you represent here, probably par excellence, are dealing with students who have something at stake. And I like Schulman's further statement that if there's no emotional investment, there's no intellectual or formational yield. It's a strong statement, but let's keep that in mind as we go forward. Ronald Barnett at London University said something similar, that we should take our students into strange places. They should venture into strange places, even anxiety-provoking places, he says. This is part of the point of higher education. If there were no anxiety, it's difficult to believe that we could be in the presence of a higher education. Now, I'm not sure we'd put that in our prospectuses, to new students and their families coming forward. Come here and we'll kind of freak your kids out and make them anxious. But again, I'm sure in the kind of work that you people do, that makes sense. It makes sense to me. It will involve students also in encountering what we call troublesome knowledge. The term came from David Perkins at Harvard, who was an advisor to the project Thresholds came out of. In a nutshell, troublesome knowledge is, it's the kind of knowledge you cannot easily fit into the conceptual schema, the conceptual pigeonholes you've already got. Very often when we encounter something which is strange or troublesome, doesn't fit with what we know, we say, oh yeah, that's just another kind of that. Threshold concept, yeah, it's another way of talking about so-and-so. And by doing that, by assimilating it, accommodating it within our current structures, it means our conceptual schema doesn't really have to change. Our conceptual frameworks can remain the same. With troublesome knowledge, you can't do that. There's nowhere to put it. It's not something that you've really encountered before. An example might be, for example, when math students get to university, they encounter a complex number where they have to deal with numbers that are imaginary. And throughout their mathematical career, they're told, maths is the bedrock of everything. When we get to the planet Tharg, eventually, the Thargians will show us a few quadratic equations, and we'll kind of share that stuff. Then they're told that we're going to use numbers that don't actually exist. This is the kind of knowledge that doesn't fit easily into their existing mathematical schema. What happens is you have to let go of that schema altogether and build it up from scratch to accommodate this new notion. And that is troublesome, that is uncomfortable, and it's not something that can be done often very quickly. It can take time, and we'll talk about this in a moment. It can lead and trigger to a liminal state. Troublesome knowledge provokes liminal states, and students can be in those states quite a while. Before we list the characteristics of a threshold in a moment, and perhaps just worth pointing out that one thing that a boundary does, or a threshold does, is mark off a more familiar, or perhaps a safer space from a riskier space. When I worked at Edinburgh University, I still live in Edinburgh, I used to pass this 17th century threshold on my way to work each morning. And the Latin inscription says, "Peace to those coming in to the house, and safety to those going out." And it reminds you, that in those days the street was perhaps not the most savoury of places, but we're often taking students across boundaries, like a threshold here, into a riskier space where you're not quite sure how things are going to pan out. And of course, medical and health contexts and surgical contexts, par excellence, involve crossing those boundaries into those risky spaces. And it's about helping students deal with that. Leslie Schwartzman, one of our collaborators in the States, says she thought all threshold scholarship is about encountering, one way or another, it's about encountering the unknown. And that real learning often involves a rupture in knowing, a little bit like those students encountering imaginary number. Here's an image. We've never found out where this image comes from, but it's an image of a portal, of a threshold. It suggests the space where we are. Here we are in the Theostry Center in Vienna, and we're looking into an untraveled world, which we're not in that space, but we feel if we were to move into that through that portal into that untraveled space, other things would come into view. And Threshold Concepts works on this spatial metaphor that we are taking students into new conceptual and new affective and emotional terrain in their learning journey with us. Threshold Concepts seem to have a particular function in opening up those previously untraveled spaces and ushering students into a new conceptual terrain where they will encounter new portals and they will encounter new landscapes, new perspectives, and so on. Between this more familiar space and that untraveled space, however, there is this in-between space as well, and the name, in a portal like that, in that archway, the name for that in Latin, a bit more Latin, is limen, L-I-M-E-N, which is the Latin for a threshold. Liminality is the state of being in a threshold. And we took that notion, we stole that notion from social anthropologists, who talk about liminal states as important states of transition. For example, adolescence as a transitional state between childhood and adulthood, or say bereavement as a transitional state. Those liminal states are the states where you have to let go of an earlier status, an earlier way of being, and adopting a new status, and often new knowledge. And we realized from our research that there seems to be something similar going on when students are encountering new and troublesome knowledge. They often enter a stage or state where they realize that their prevailing understanding of a topic actually no longer holds. But a bit like that glimpsed view of an untraveled terrain, the new understanding hasn't yet come into being, and the new way of thinking and practicing hasn't yet become clear either. But they have to continue, and we have to work with students whilst they're in that state. The interesting thing we found from our research is they can be in that state a very long time. And we're talking about years occasionally. And very often those students might pass a module. It doesn't necessarily mean that they have integrated the new knowledge that they've encountered in that module or that course. They are very probably still, to a lesser or greater extent, in a liminal state as they enter the next module or course, where they will encounter new thresholds. And it's often sometimes in a later semester or a later year of the program that things integrate and things come together. What Threshold Concepts tend to do, one of their features, and we'll list them in a moment, is it's a bit like when you are making a jigsaw picture and you have a number of pieces. Imagine those pieces as disparate, discrete concepts. Sometimes one piece will actually pull the others together into a meaningful shape. And certain concepts seem to do that. They pull together other ideas into a meaningful pattern. But it is rarely sudden, it's rarely an aha moment or a penny dropping or the light bulb coming on. It's usually a much messier, contracted, gradual affair. And students can be in that state of misunderstanding for some time. There's one paper I have in my office somewhere, the title which is "They Don't Understand, But They'll Pass." And they do, and we do pass them. And I think it's not because we want their fees for the next year. I think it's because we realize it will take a while for some of these things to come together. When they do access a threshold concept, for example, in economics, which Ron mentioned, where we did the earlier work on this work, if a student understands opportunity cost, if they understand it fully, they then realize that many aspects of economics are to do with choices and with choice-influenced decisions. Once they understand that, it opens up new terrain. It takes them into a new terrain where other economic concepts then become meaningful and available to them. If they don't understand it, they don't progress. They remain in a liminal state and they don't enter the new conceptual space, and the new insights waiting through that threshold we looked at don't come into view. If they can get engagement with a threshold concept, however, they do have a transformed internal view of subject matter and possibly a transformation of their worldview as well. And, for example, gender theory would be a very good example of that. I've spoken to many students who after they'd encountered gender theory, they said everything changed. Not just the program they were studying, but the way they saw their personal relationships, their own family histories, the society around them, and so on. So another factor about threshold concepts is there isn't just a conceptual change. There is also a shift in the way you think and practice, and the shift to some extent in who and what you are. And of course, you are training people to enter various professional communities where they will have to think and practice as a surgeon, where they will have to think and practice as a physiologist, and so on. And entrance into those communities of practice, to some extent, is determined by the knowledge you have access to. As a colleague of mine, Glenn's cousin, says, you are what you know. Now, here we have an anatomy session going on. And it's been suggested by a number of medical writers I've read that one's first encounter dissecting a cadaver it entails an ontological shift, or what Plenary calls a change in subjectivity. One writer, some of you may be familiar with, who I am very fond of, is the late Paul Kalaniti, who wrote a wonderful book called When Breath Becomes Air, about training to be a neurosurgeon. Sadly, he himself became ill during the writing of that book and died shortly after he finished it. So as he was writing the book, he was dying himself. But he was talking about his first session his first anatomy session, cutting open a cadaver. And he says, the scalpel doesn't so much cut the skin as unzip it, revealing the hidden and forbidden sinew beneath. And despite your preparation, you're caught unawares, ashamed and excited. Cadaver dissection is a medical rite of passage and a trespass on the sacrosanct, engendering a legion of feelings, from revulsion, exhilaration, nausea, frustration and awe, to, as time passes, the mere tedium of academic exercise. Everything teeters between pathos and bathos. Here you are, violating society's most fundamental taboos. And yet, formaldehyde is a powerful appetite stimulant, so you also crave a burrito. Now, this struck me, having never done this, it struck me this, in order to do this kind of practice, you have to become a special kind of person. And he himself, looking around his fellow classmates, watching them, was taken by this as well. When I faced my cadaver, he said, slightly blue and bloated, his total deadness and total humanness were undeniable. The knowledge that in 4 months I would be bisecting this man's head with a hacksaw seemed unconscionable. Then he looked around. I turned around and I saw a classmate, the sort of woman who had a mug decorated with puffy paint, tiptoeing on the stool, cheerfully hammering a chisel into a woman's backbone, splinters flying through the air. Hadn't I just as eagerly dissembled a man's ribcage with a pair of bolt cutters? Now, this is work that has to be done, but not everyone can do it, including me. There is a shift here in ontology. You are becoming, through this knowledge and practice, a different kind of practitioner, a different kind of person, and an important kind of person. What he said is, this for him was about the transformation by knowledge and practice into becoming a surgeon. Cadaver dissection epitomizes for many the transformation of the somber, respectful student into the callous, arrogant doctor. But what he says is, but those people don't become callous. And he talks about the way that the humanity of these cadavers still catches you unawares. Even working on the dead with their faces covered, their names a mystery, you find that their humanity pops out at you. In opening my cadaver's stomach, I found 2 undigested morphine pills, meaning that he died in pain, perhaps alone, and fumbling with the cap of a pill bottle. And he says elsewhere, and I think this is important, because what we've also noticed with threshold concepts is there's always a shift in discourse. As you gain new knowledge, you talk and write differently. And even here, we were instructed to no longer call them cadavers. Donors was the preferred term. And from then on, he talks about donors, which of course is a respectful term. And with all professional practice, there comes a shift in discourse, which can also be troublesome. So, the claim we're making, and we need to say a lot more about threshold concepts. We haven't got time, but just in outline, there are lots of important concepts in a program. For example, if you are studying physics, a centre of gravity, or in engineering, a centre of gravity is an important concept. It's a key concept. It's not a threshold concept. It doesn't open up entry into a new space of understanding in the way that the concept of gravity does in physics. Gravity is a threshold concept in that sense. Evolution is a threshold concept that children even encounter at primary school nowadays. But these threshold concepts, like gravity, like opportunity cost, they integrate a number of concepts together to enable a new way of seeing, which in itself then transforms you. Or it might be a practice as well. It could be a threshold practice. This becomes, in our experience, irreversible. You don't forget evolution if you've understood it properly. And it is bounded in two ways, in the sense that the concepts take you across boundaries into new conceptual space. But they're also bounded in the sense that the meaning of a concept, say, like uncertainty, means something specific within the boundaries of, say, surgical practice, than it does in environmental science, for example, or in the law, or in jazz. So the discipline itself, within its boundaries, puts particular angles on concepts, and it means that they are kind of interpreted specifically within the context of a particular discipline. But these concepts, as we've said, they also change you. You are what you know. They reconstitute who you are, like gender, for example, or the theory of a limit in mathematics. If you understand that, it takes you into the world of calculus. You then think of yourself as a bit more of a mathematician. The language changes also, and very frequently, these concepts are the troublesome ones. They're the important ones that you have to get in order to move you onto the next conceptual terrain you have to enter. But for some students, they are the tough ones as well. We did some work at Imperial College in London. All their students, straight A students. And someone said, but every year, 10% of the computing science students, they just can't do object-oriented programming. They just don't get it. It just doesn't come together for them. And how do we get them out of that stuck space? So these are important concepts that move us forward. Similarly with troublesome knowledge, which again is a fascinating area, threshold concepts seem to bring with them the seeds of troublesome knowledge. They provoke a state of troubled knowledge in the students. But knowledge can be troublesome for a wide variety of reasons. And if you have students who are stuck and you're hoping to help them into a greater degree of clarity, it's always worth asking what might be the source of the troublesomeness for these students. Why can't these computing scientists get object-oriented programming? The other students seem to get it okay. It may be the way that we have historically ritualized the presentation of knowledge within our particular discipline. It may be that we don't use it enough. David Perkins at Harvard talks about knowledge sitting in the mind's attic, inert knowledge. Sometimes things are just bloody hard. I used to have to teach deconstruction in literary theory. And sometimes I think, yeah, I've kind of got this, and I teach. And then I'd read another paper, and I think, I'm not sure I have got this. It's like one paper ahead of the students very often, but I was in what we often see in the liminal state. You get a kind of oscillation, 2 steps forward and 1 step back. You think, yeah, this is coming together, and you think, oh no, I'm not sure about this. And I won't tell you how many engineers I've met who said they've never understood Fourier's transform, even though they have to teach it. It's a black box to them. It may be because the student doesn't want to go that way. They can see what this new area of knowledge is bringing into view for them, and they realize that the change, the transformation it will entail, something like evolution, for example, challenges a lot of existing prevailing beliefs, perhaps your religious beliefs. It is troublesome in that regard, and it may not be that you actually want to go down that road. Charles Darwin, studying as a medical student at Edinburgh University, decided, that anatomy was not for him because he kept fainting most of the time and throwing up. So he went down to the beach at Leith and started looking at shells and things instead and did pretty well. But, he could see where medicine was taking him and didn't go down that way. Knowledge is very often, threshold knowledge is very often what Perkins calls alien knowledge. It's like imaginary number. Sometimes it just sounds daft, it's weird. It's just not the kind of knowledge you've encountered before and you don't know how to deal with it. It might be the discourse itself that is the problem. Another problem is very often we assume that students know certain things that in fact we haven't taught them, and we've just assumed they have taught it. It might be a first year class where you say, well, yeah, I didn't get a very good grade for this. Not much evidence of critical reasoning going on here. Oh, right. So when did we do that? In the module. It hasn't been covered. And very often when we do work with students to find out where the source of troublesome might be, it's something that has been left tacit. You know it. Your colleagues know it. But it hasn't occurred to you that your students have maybe come up a different route. And so on. There are various ways, we won't go through them all, but it's always worth asking what might be the source of the troublesomeness in this regard. One of the things David Perkins said is if students don't get something one way, change the mode. So we're changing the mode. We're showing you a picture here. This is, I have to say to you, people from very different cultures. This is a very Western image. It's an old Flemish image taken from the Christian Judaic tradition of the Garden of Eden. And it's an image of the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden and gaining knowledge from the tree of good and evil. I'm not using it here, I stress, for any religious purposes, but as a kind of educational narrative or fable, like a little flickering movie going from left to right. What is interesting here is that the world of Eden seems a very safe world. It's like a medieval walled city, like Vienna used to be. It's also rather uterine, isn't it, if you look at it? It's a womb-like space, so it's a walled city, it's a uterus, it's a safe space. The figure of God, the protector, is there. It's a safe space. But it's also a space where not much change happens. Adam and Eve seem happy enough doing the same things every day in the garden until the serpent comes on the left with this troublesome fruit, troublesome knowledge, and says, try this. And that kind of livens things up a little bit. Interesting to note Adam and Eve's response here on the left. Eve's curious, and they're a bit like modern students. I might sign up for this module. Looks quite interesting. Adam is he's not so happy about this. He's the student who would ask, is this credit bearing, or will this, will this be in the exam? It's like that kind of. Defended learner. But anyway, they do engage with this troublesome knowledge, whatever that knowledge is, probably sexuality or something they haven't encountered before, but it changes them. And they can't stay in that space. The angel, this rather red, forbidding angel here, ushers them out conveniently through a threshold, which suits our purposes, ushers them through the threshold and says, you can't come back into this safe space. You can't come back into the womb. Because they are no longer those more innocent figures of the left. The knowledge has changed them. But what is interesting is they don't want to leave that safe space. They don't want to go out into this rather bleak-seeming world where things are not so clear, where things are riskier, more uncertain. And they weep as they go out there. It feels like loss to them. And in fact, they have lost something. They've lost that earlier prevailing view of knowledge, which they've had to abandon. And they've lost a kind of earlier version of themselves. They have been reconstituted and transfigured by the knowledge that they have encountered. And it isn't always comfortable. And our students often, want to stay in what might be a more comfortable, safer, womb-like space. And it's our job, I'm not suggesting you become serpents, though being wise as servants and gentle as doves might be a way forward. But, we have to push them, deliver them from that uterine space into another space. And the serpent follows them in that image. There will be more trouble in that regard. One of my students said, well, you've always got to read the apple conditions when you're in these situations. But as we said, threshold knowledge, encounter with threshold concepts, and we suggest, courses should be designed on this basis. As students are going to move into more sophisticated understandings and practices, we need to push them out of that prevailing mode. And it's very rarely, in my experience, that students get to grips very quickly, immediately, with this kind of complex knowledge that they haven't encountered before. Often they enter what we call this liminal state, this threshold state, which is a kind of suspended state where students wanting to do well will kind of try and please you and kind of mimic what they think is required. And you will know mimicry when you encounter it in that sense. But there is this feeling of being unsettled, of having lost something. And I think we need to honour that. I'll say a little more about that in a moment, because our research suggests students do feel uncomfortable about that. But in these liminal states, the students, they have to count on something new. They realise their existing view won't hold, has to get rid of that, and also this earlier version of who and what they were as medical students becoming now entering clerkships or their first year placements and so on. They also have to envisage and accept an alternative version of themselves as a practitioner, what Generous calls a reauthoring of self, which is challenging. They are, as she says, undoing the script of themselves. A bit like that woman, hacking the spine with a chisel. This is probably not something she did a year earlier. She is reauthoring herself in a very profound and challenging way. And what inevitably comes with this are new forms of written and spoken discourse, which themselves may be part of the issue. Sociology students encountering huge tracts of kind of Germanic prose as they deal with Marxist theory and so on. It's often the language and the style of the language itself which can be a problem. But James Atherton, a colleague sadly died a year or two ago, wrote a paper called Learning as Loss. It's out on the web. Very interesting paper. And what he said is, this is when you encounter supplantive learning, when a newer form of learning has to supplant the one you're comfortable with and which has constituted what you are up until that point. It entails a degree of loss of competence and perhaps of confidence because a previous skill has to be abandoned while the learner is still on the learning curve of the new understanding. So you get a pattern a little bit like this, where the old learning is fading away. I mean, it's what Atherton calls a learning trough, but you're still very low on the curve of the new learning. And that's where students need a lot of support, emotional support and encouragement, and the kind of recognition that, well, yeah, we've all traveled this way. It's like this for everyone. It's going to be, tough. Hang in there, be resilient. I have colleagues like Julie Rattray in Durham, who is working on the affective states of liminality. What characterizes the students who get through this and hold in, as opposed to those who drop out? Because at these liminal states, that's where students are most vulnerable of dropping out. We'll have a look at one in a second. And that's where they need the support. So what thresholds do, and what supplantive learning does, it kind of destabilizes your present quality of knowing. It disorients you for a while, which can be exciting. We're experienced learners. We like new ideas. Oh, this is a bit weird. Oh, this is interesting. We like being disoriented. 18-year-old students don't, because they've got exams coming up. And then they have to reorient themselves. Here's a student from a project we were involved in Trondheim in Norway, Transarc, a very interesting project. And I think Leif Martin, who's one of the leaders of that project, I think is going to be with us at this conference because he's now working with medics. But this was about transforming architects and transforming architecture. But here's a student who's clearly who's in that kind of learning trough, and it's not coming together. And if you look at the language here, it was completely new, it's unknown, it was difficult, not clever enough, no control, frustration, stress, exhausted, depressed, wanted to quit. And it makes us realize, and again, particularly in highly stressful professional situations and programs like those you work in, we have to be very careful that we don't push students to this point where they are about to quit. 3 months later, however, this student was just excited, exhilarated. It had started to come together. You know, he had entered this new conceptual space. I don't quite know what he's talking about, but it's about edges and ridges and sensual appreciation in architectural formation. And he was just telling everyone about it. He was highly inspired and motivated because he crossed this threshold gradually. So I think the term troublesome probably comes from John Dewey, the great American educator originally, who said it takes troublesome work to undertake the alteration of old beliefs. You know, you've got to get people out of the mental ruts already made. That's hard to do because they constitute what we are. Keynes, the famous economist, said, you know, it's not so much new ideas, it's getting rid of the old ideas, which ramify into every corner of our minds. So what we find with thresholds is it's you know, a kind of two-headed thing here. There's a change in knowledge, there's an epistemological shift, but there's also this important change in our sense of ourselves as practitioners of a particular profession. We really need, I can't think of a three-headed God. If you've got a three-headed God, then we put discourse down there as well, because all these things interact and change at the same time. But it is what we call a transformational model of learning, in that it is knowledge which changes you. These ducks, let's imagine them as undergraduates entering your programs. They don't realize as they leave their programs, in this Escher cartoon here of metamorphosis, they don't realize they're going to come out as fish, you know, because, you know, they can't see that far ahead. You are a fish, you know, because you've been through that journey and you know where they're going. But there comes a point in that process, somewhere in the middle, if you look, where you can't tell whether they're fish or fowl. You can't tell whether they're going forwards or backwards. And this liminal stage, this betwixt and between stage, as the social anthropologists call it, can be challenging for students, and they need supporting through it. I once asked an entomologist, we were talking about, you know, cheesy images of metamorphosis and transformation. You know, the temptation is, you know, stick up a caterpillar and the beautiful butterfly coming out. I said, if you cut open a chrysalis, like what's in there? You know, is it like a kind of child's understanding of like a caterpillar with little wings kind of thing? And she said, oh no, it's just dust, you know, it's just goo, you know, which wasn't the answer I was expecting. But, you know, learning, well, perhaps not as dramatic as that, but, you know, to some extent we are taking students through a similar kind of breaking down to rebuild them up again into something beautiful that will fly forward. Just a couple of other points about thresholds, and then we'll look at the medical side of this. I think this is what Kierkegaard called transcendental teaching, and Geert Bierster, another modern educationist, has referred to as transcendental learning. It's the idea that learning is something that comes over your horizon. Transcendental learning is that which transcends your current horizons, and it takes another to do that, probably you, someone who has traveled further than you. It's not very similar to the Socratic or maieutic. You know, maieutic is midwifery. You know, the idea that it's all there in the student anyway, they'll find it for themselves, you just kind of deliver it out of them. Kierkegaard appears to say, no, you're probably not going to go off on a project for 6 months and put together general theory of relativity. You need someone to bring this over your horizon. So it brings the knowledge of the teacher back into the equation in a serious way. Bierster also is a bit unhappy about the term learning itself, feeling it's become a bit overemphasized in modern times. You know, learning, you know, as a process in itself. Learning always needs content and it always needs purpose. So education might be a better term, he suggests, because it involves others. You know, so this notion of alterity, where you need another to bring the new knowledge to you, like the serpent in that image of Eden. But also it's a double truth giving, because it's not just that you will bring students the new knowledge that they wouldn't have found on their own. You also give them the means of validating it and verifying it, why this is knowledge worth believing to base your decisions on. So this becomes part of your rational judgment, your reasoned judgment making. You know, there's a lot of information out there students can find, but they don't always have the means to judge whether it's reliable or not. So, you know, going into new landscapes is one thing, as the writer Proust said, but it's also having new eyes and seeing the universe with the eyes of another. And those will most probably be your eyes. Here are some concepts almost at random from different disciplines. These are threshold concepts. But if we look at now, if we think of this in terms of your own environments, some interesting work being done, which I would point you to. Bart and colleagues in the States did some interesting work on what medical trainees grappled with in their clerkship years, and they came up with this list. And it's an interesting paper to read in medical education. They characterized these as potential threshold concepts for these students, and they have interesting quotes from them. There are other people working on other concepts, some in the audience here tonight. But the notion of care itself, Lynn Clowder really problematized this. Students come in with a very romantic view of what care is, and then they meet some 80-year-old lady spitting and effing and blinding at them and calling them everything under the sun, and realize that this is part of the caring process too. The whole business of touch, and who can touch whom and where in different cultures and within and across medical practice. Hilary Neve's done some interesting work on that. The notions of feeling authentic internally or being seen externally as someone who is practicing in an authentic fashion, and so on. All of these things people have found are interesting thresholds within different aspects of the health curriculum. Linda Martindale did her research on the use of evidence-based practice, and undergraduate nurses found this, to some extent, a very troublesome process. This is what medics did. It wasn't what they did, but they had to learn the discourse and the language of research to some extent in order to practice from an evidence basis, and so on. Fiona Watson looked at social models of recovery as opposed to medical models, and that seems to be very provocative within certain medical areas. Again, how do you speak about dementia care? What language, what discourse is appropriate as you become a dementia carer, and so on. Homeostasis with areas of drug use and so on. Getting students to understand, what are the symptoms here that are affecting the patient, or what is the body just trying to right the ship itself, and so on. How do you distinguish? But also these ontological shifts that we were talking about, and then Randall and others did some work which AMEE have published themselves. That's a very moving piece. I found it very moving. Again, students, discovering that life is not fair. And one student talking about a 12-year-old girl who died when she was working with her. And that depressed her for a long time. That there are no right answers, you're always going to be in grey areas and so on. And that it's not enough just to be smart. You've got to take the patient into account, and so on. I would say probably the most important area that comes out as a threshold for dealing with is uncertainty. And there's quite a bit written about this. A very interesting new paper by Ilden and others came out last year about the need for all health practitioners to become comfortable with uncertainty. I think you are engaged in pedagogies of uncertainty yourselves, where you have to have the confidence to act on a problem where you don't have full confidence in what the underlying cause is. And you have to act even when the downstream outcomes aren't clear. You can't do nothing in that sense. And it takes, a lot to think and practice in that fashion. As they say, to act with confidence while simultaneously remaining uncertain is a paradox that epitomizes expert practice. And I'm sure you are all familiar with that. But introducing your students to get to that level of comfort with uncertainty is very challenging. And I think it takes a lot of sensitivity in the design of courses and the kinds of experiences you will be putting them through. So how do people like yourselves manage the uncertainty from complex, ill-defined problems where there are conflicting assumptions, evidence, and opinion which may lead to different solutions? And that's where, as we started, you need the capability to make reasoned and informed judgments, to have the confidence of that, and to make decisions, even though you are still in a grey area. And what they say is, won't quite more from that, but they say one thing is to differentiate uncertainty from ambiguity. The properties of a situation might be ambiguous, but the uncertainty is actually in you and your decisions. One is a set of properties out there, the other is a state within you, and students need to understand that. If we've just got time here, not to run over time, I hope this will run up. There's a wonderful resource here. The gods of cyberspace, oh yes, we're here, right, very good. This is a very large site kept at, University College London by Dr. McFlanagan. If you go to the subject index there, if you can see that, and click, say, on medicine, M for medicine, here we go. There are lots of other disciplines here, but you'll see there are lots of papers here on medicine. A lot of them are downloadable. They're all to do with work people have done on threshold concepts in medicine. And there's a section on mental health, and there's a section on nursing. It's a very rich site. There's OT, physiotherapy, it goes on and on and on. Osteopathy, palliative care, patient care, pharmacy, pharmacology, process, and so on. So if you are interested, do check out that site. If you just search on thresholds and Flanagan, it will bring up that site. There's also a society, a network, Catch, very active. They won't go to that site now, but if you look them up on the web, there's also a special issue of the International Journal of Practice-Based Learning on threshold concepts, which was interesting. Okay, just to conclude, it seems to me that thresholds fits, not that we designed it such, but I think it is part of the zeitgeist, a good Vienna word, of our time. You know, we did a little seminar a while ago asking people how they would characterize the state we're in now, in 2018, 2019. And they came up with this list. You could probably come up with your own, but it will probably be fairly similar. You know, this is the world our students and you are already in, what the philosopher Anthony Appiah called a dance with ambiguities. One of my Ghanaian students showed me this lovely image, which is often used for education. It's a Adinkra symbol. It's a bird flying forward, and as it flies forward, it turns and takes an egg from its back, an egg of wisdom to carry into the future. And it's a lovely image for, you know, educators passing the wisdom of knowledge on to the next generation. It's a lovely image. I think the question is now for us, you know, do we have that? Do we have that egg of wisdom, or are we actually flying into a future that we are not familiar with either? So I think we need to think about that. As Barnett said, we're preparing students for uncertainty, and yet we're putting more and more certainty into our curricula in terms of precise learning outcomes and specifications. What he says is we need to move our curricula further to the right of this diagram, both on ontologies and both on knowledges, into a riskier acceptance. The students at Manchester University accused their professors last year, you know, why are you still teaching us pre-crash economics? Doesn't work. You know, show us something from our time, and so on. Bisa talked about the beautiful risk of education, which is a nice phrase, and I think, you know, we should embrace that. He uses the word learnification by putting too much emphasis on learning and not enough on teaching. You know, we are a distinguished, honourable profession, and he says there's a difference from learning from teachers and being taught by them. Being taught by a teacher means being taken into these new terrains. And also that will mean questioning safe space. To suggest, as Stengel-Weems say, that students can be free from self-doubt, hostility, fear, or non-affirmation. There are no such spaces. That's a controversial area. We could talk elsewhere about that. But this is tricky. Bell Hooks said, you know, her students, you know, she's very cool, feminist writer, students love her courses until they get in them, and then they find they're really hard. And then she says, you know, and then she gets rubbish appraisals. And I think this is a problem. I think we have a situation now where if we are taking students into areas of troublesome knowledge, our quality assurance procedures need to catch up, because I know a lot of younger teachers are being penalised for adopting pedagogies of uncertainty. They then get, you know, they put students into states of liminality, the students get unsettled and give them a low score. And I think this is wrong. We are penalising basically teachers who are taking students into strange places. And if we have a quality system which is risk averse, I think we need to look at that. Pam Codron said, My teachers have always pushed me over a cliff. But quality assurance agencies are not quite happy with teachers like that. But as John Gray says, anyone who shrinks away from these situations is in effect refusing to explore what it means to be human. Howard Jacobson says the same thing. When we turn our backs on difficulty, we turn our backs on who we are. So these are uncompromising statements. But I would suggest, higher education, yes, of course we want our students to be happy. But I have to say, in 42 years of teaching, might be something to do with my teaching, I've never seen students do this, ever, anyway. There are a lot of aspects of student life which be commodified. We can give them nice lecture theatres, nice halls of residence, coffee bars. You cannot commodify transformational learning. You can't say, I'll pay more for this gym, make me slim and fit. It doesn't work like that. You've got to put in the work. This is not a hotel, this is a gym. You've got to do the work. Lots of books about this, but I need to stop there. I will be around the conference for a couple of days. If you want to come and talk to me, please do. If not, you can email me there with any particular questions, because it has been a rather telescope version. And that applies to our colleagues out in global cyberspace. I hope you're still there. Again, please do get in touch with me. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Ray. I think we have time for a couple of questions. There are microphones in the aisles, both here and here. If you have any questions, perhaps you'd like to move to the aisle.
It's sometimes said threshold concepts are a threshold concept themselves, or if you're in a state of liminality, then that's fine.
Is that Rachel I see there? Yes, Rachel Eloise got the first question. Rachel, could you introduce yourself first, if people I'm sure don't know you?
Sure. Rachel Alloway, University of Calgary. Ray, thank you so much for the work that you do in this area and all the things you've been working on. One of the things I wanted to sort of pick up on one of your last comments was the idea of a necessary difficulty in learning. One of the things I'd like to sort of push a bit further is that there's an implication that there's grief and trauma potentially in the learning experience. And yet we are paying a lot of attention to wellness, resilience, making learning spaces safe and respectful. Can you say how the concept of threshold ideas, threshold concepts allows us to challenge and maybe negotiate the paradox that this creates? Yeah,
you're absolutely right, Rachel. And I remember we worked together a long time ago, didn't we? Hello again. Yes, nice to see you. Yes, you're right. This is a controversial area. It's a very troublesome area, and certainly. I'm certainly not advocating, that we do not have regulations and caring systems within our practice which recognises that students may have had traumatic experiences in their previous experience, and we don't want to expose them to that. Or we will not tolerate, again, practices which are, not accepted within our communities or legally within our cultures. So we're not talking about exposing students to sexist or racist or other forms of abuse about their identities and so on. I think what we need to emphasize to our students is, yes, we are working in a respectful space, but that the knowledge itself will entail degrees of difficulty. And not to kind of underestimate that. And how we do this, I don't have easy answers, but there is some interesting work done in the States about what enables students, they call it PsyCap, funny word, psychological capital, they call it. What seems to be required in students to enable them to navigate these liminal spaces, a bit like that architecture student. That student was clearly having a very difficult time, and I don't think we would want students to get that stressed out in any course. But what they found is, yes, they need to develop their own skills of self-regulation, they need to develop resilience, and so on. But they also found that actually attitudes of hopefulness are very helpful, and that hopefulness, and you can measure degrees of hopefulness within a program, the kind of climate of hopefulness is very much influenced by the attitudes of the teacher. This is going to be tough, but it's going to be exciting. We're going to get there. Do what you're asked to do, hang in there, you'll make it. Rather than, as you were saying, presenting kind of doom-laden, gloomy scenarios of, ooh, well, 30% of students always drop out. So fostering climates of hopefulness and optimism, which are not necessarily the same thing, but
Ray, I think we have another question.
Yeah, sure.
Here.
So
Sorry.
it's a kind of
Sorry
cocktail
to
of things, but
interrupt
that helps. Yeah.
Question, the microphone number 7. And would you introduce yourself and ask your question, please?
Yes. Good evening. My name is Rachel, and I'm a 5th-year medical student from the Chinese University of Hong Kong. So I'm very grateful as a medical student that we have this craft 6 years of time just to study, just to explore in the library, and to push through our limits. But my question is, because in 2 years' time, I'll be graduating, and though that I'm moving into a new trainee program, postgraduate program, and somehow I wish to become a medical educator in the future. But as we're becoming more independent, we don't have that designated teacher. We don't have a very well-designed experience that will be shown in front of our face. So I wonder if there is, if this concept of threshold concept still apply to teachers in medical education, and is there a time dimension in your theory that will evolve from undergraduate education to postgraduate education, and somehow in the future, who knows, maybe as you, a retired, renowned professor, do you still have that wow moments, that transformational experience, that pushing you through your limitation? Thank you.
Yeah. I've been trying to.
I think we've time for one quick answer.
Yeah.
Just one other. We'll take one more question, and then we have to stop.
Quick response to that. Thank you for that, Rachel. I've been a student of jazz guitar for, I think, 52 years, and I'm still in a liminal state, but I do have kind of wow moments. But it's very interesting to hear from yourself, Rachel, as an undergraduate student. I think, well, I would say this, where this model might help the people who design the courses like the one you're on, is in asking the questions, what really matters in this program? I think it's worth asking any team of people within a department. They talk about research a lot, but talking about teaching, what are the key things that students really have to get their heads and minds around in this program, and in what sequence should they encounter it, and in what manner should they encounter it, through simulations, on the wards, or whatever. Because they are the ones who will design that journey that you're going through, and hopefully will design it from the undergraduate level right up to postgraduate experience, practice experience, and then becoming medical academics at the same time. But someone always has to make the decisions about what knowledge you're going to encounter and in what sequence and how you're going to encounter it.
I'm sorry, we've only time for one more question, and we have one online question. John, you tell.
Online question here for you. Can thresholds be crossed in an unsupervised learning situation?
Yes, I think they can, but I think it comes back to, but I think it would inevitably bring with it an element of haphazardness in that sense. I like Kierkegaard's notion that you need educated people who have traversed this journey before, who will bring this transcendental knowledge over your horizon. They know what the journey lies ahead. If you're a kind of self-taught person or learning by yourself, you don't know whether you're on the right road or whether you're going off on a very different journey. So you will go on a different journey. But in terms of important disciplines like the ones you have, where it is very important to have effective, reliable, evidence-based practice, I think it behoves us to have people who have that kind of transcendental perspective and can guide you on that journey. If you look through lots of mythology, the hero's journey, if you're familiar with that, the traveller there's always a guide who appears and takes them through this liminal space because they know what lies further on.
Well, thank you. We'll take one last quick question. Again, microphone number 7.
Hi, I'm Mike, a 4th-year student from Albert Einstein College of Medicine. I actually had a question that maybe relates to what you had just said about the guide. So in terms of sort of dealing with this new knowledge and the uncertainty that it could bring, I'm wondering if the way that we present that information or the way that students are used to tackling new information really affects their ability to meaningfully engage with, things that they find unfamiliar. For example, I could at least say for the States that a lot of the learning up, at least until medical school, is, for example, not problem-based. So it is very much, there's a lecture, 40-something slides or whatever it is. You have that information, you go home, you memorize it, and then you come back. So I'm just wondering if maybe there was even an introduction earlier to such problem-based learning, or a way to help students engage with these unfamiliar concepts in a systematic way, what your thoughts on that are.
Yes, and a couple of things, and again, we're short of time. I mean, I don't want to get into a debate about, whether medical programs should be based on PBL or not. And I think one of the values of PBL, of course, it attempts to bring that world of risk and uncertainty and messiness into the program in all its complexity. What we found through research on thresholds is actually, if you break down threshold knowledge into bite-sized chunks to try and enable students to get it bit by bit, step by step, they perform worse than the ones who deal with the complete messiness. It seems that threshold knowledge, you have to get the integrity of it. But on that list of kind of ontological aspects from that American study, I think it was the Randall study, the first point they make is that students have to have an active approach to learning, and what they emphasize is they must be willing to enter cases of unfamiliarity. They have to be pushed into strange places, like Barnett says, and go beyond their comfort zones in that sense. So whether you design programs more around PBL approaches or not, I think what is important is that taking students into strange places and encountering troublesome knowledge is what it matters. An interesting resource on that, there's an interesting book on threshold concepts and problem-based learning by Maggie Savin-Baden, and she's working a lot with medics, so that might be an interesting source for you to start from.
Could we thank Ray for a very interesting...
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ray.